The morning Clara Mercer signed the divorce papers, she had $47 in her checking account. That was what 11 years of marriage looked like when you reduced it to a number. $47. Light enough to be insulting. Heavy enough to make her chest hurt every time she thought about it. Her ex-husband, Garrett, had taken everything. The house she'd refinished with her own hands. The car. The savings he'd drained the morning he filed. His attorneys called it legally appropriate. Clara called it something else entirely in the privacy of her own mind. What Garrett didn't take was a cabin in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia. Not out of generosity. He didn't take it because it was worth $1. That was the county's assessment, $1. And Garrett Mercer was not a man who paid attention to things that didn't perform. His attorneys looked at the number and moved on. A reasonable decision by any rational measure. It was also the worst financial mistake anyone in that room would ever make. Because beneath that $1 cabin in a cellar, no one knew existed. Clara's grandmother had been building something for 40 years. Something assembled on a librarian's salary by a woman who drove the same car for 21 years and wore her shoes until they wore through. Something worth more than the house. Garrett took more than the savings he drained, more than everything he thought he'd won. This is the story of how a woman with $47 inherited a fortune, and how a grandmother who'd been dead for 11 years saved her life. The sky outside the courthouse was the specific shade of gray that Pennsylvania saved for funerals and endings. Clara noticed it through the tall, narrow window at the end of the hallway. The way the clouds pressed down flat and heavy over the city like a lid being closed on something that would not be opened again. She signed where her attorney pointed. She did not read the pages again. She had already read them 6 times over the previous 3 weeks, each reading a fresh confirmation of everything she had already lost. Everything Garrett had already taken. Everything the law had decided was fair and settled and done. She walked out of the courthouse at 11:14 in the morning with a folder of documents under her arm and a checking account that held a number so small it felt like a verdict rather than a balance. Garrett had been thorough. She would give him that much. She had always known he was thorough. It was one of the things she had once admired about him. The way he approached every problem like it was a project with phases and deliverables and a clear path to completion. He had approached the divorce the same way. Methodical, organized, patient in a way that only people with resources and attorneys on retainer could afford to be. He had taken the house in Chestnut Hill. The 4-bedroom colonial with the porch she had refinished herself over 2 summers, stripping the old paint down to bare wood on her hands and knees, sanding every board smooth, applying 3 coats of marine-grade sealant because she had read that marine grade lasted longer and she had intended for that porch to last. The one with the kitchen she had designed, tile by tile from a magazine she had torn pages out of for years before they could finally afford it. He had taken the car, a claim based on financial contributions that his attorneys outlined in language so precise it sounded like surgery. clean cuts, no ragged edges, nothing left behind that could be contested or reconsidered or appealed. Hy had cleaned out the joint savings account the morning he filed, a move his lawyer called legally appropriate given the circumstances. A move Clara called something else entirely in the privacy of her own mind. In the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when she lay on her friend's couch and stared at the ceiling and reviewed the inventory of her losses with the exhaustive attention of a woman who had nothing else to review. Hy had left her the furniture in the spare bedroom, which was generous only if you ignored that she had nowhere to put it. He had left her a kitchen appliance set she had bought before the marriage. He had left her the folder of documents she now carried under her arm, and he had left her $47 in a checking account that still had both their names on it until the final paperwork cleared. And he had left her something else, though she would not understand that for another 3 weeks. He had left her a cabin, not intentionally. That was the thing that would matter later. That would sit in her chest like a coal, warming slowly in the dark. Garrett had not forgotten about the cabin out of generosity or grace. He had forgotten about it because it was worth nothing, because it appeared in no financial disclosure as an asset of consequence, because his attorneys had looked at the property value assessment and decided correctly by any rational measure that a 900 square foot structure in the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia, assessed at $1 by the county tax office, due to its state of structural disrepair, was not worth the paperwork. It had been listed in the asset column of their shared records exactly once, 4 years into the marriage, when Clara's grandmother, Margaret Calloway, had passed it to her through a will so brief it barely filled a single page. Garrett had glanced at the assessment and moved on. He was not a man who paid attention to things that did not perform. Clara had been staying on the couch in her friend Jolene's apartment in Harrisburg since the week she left the house in Chestnut Hill. Jolene was generous with the couch, less generous with her opinions about Garrett, which she offered freely and without prompting at intervals throughout the day. Jolene believed that opinions like coffee were most effective when delivered strong and often, and she acted accordingly. Clara was grateful for the couch and the coffee, and even for the opinions, though she rarely said so out loud, because saying so felt like confirming that the situation was as bad as it was. And she was not ready for that particular confirmation. The apartment was small. Jolene had a 7-year-old daughter named Wren, who watched cartoons at a volume calibrated for concert halls, and fell asleep every night on the floor of the living room, surrounded by small plastic toys that Clara stepped on in the dark, with the reliability of a woman being punished for something she had not done yet. She slept in 4-hour stretches, waking at intervals to the sound of street traffic and her own thoughts, which were never quiet and never kind in the middle of the night. She made lists in the dark. Job applications pending 23. Callbacks received 2. Second interviews 0. The lists did not help, but the making of them gave her hands something to do, gave her mind a framework that felt slightly more manageable than the formless anxiety that lived in the space between waking and sleeping. She had worked in marketing before. not glamorously. She had spent 8 years managing content and communications for a mid-size manufacturing firm outside Philadelphia. A job she had been good at. A job she had been proud of. In the quiet way she was proud of most things, privately and without fanfare. She had left the position 2 years into the marriage, when Garrett's income made her salary feel unnecessary, and his schedule made her presence at home feel important. She told herself it was a pause. She told herself she would go back when the time was right. She had not understood yet that the time being right was not something that happened on its own. It required tending. It required someone to hold the door open while you walked through it, and she had married a man who preferred closing doors behind him to holding them open for others. So now she was 41 years old, with an 8-year gap in her resume and a marketing landscape that had transformed itself completely in that time. A fact every recruiter she spoke to managed to communicate without saying it directly. She was not unemployable. She was, as one particularly cheerful HR representative had explained a candidate with a re-entry challenge. Clara had thanked the woman and hung up and stared at the wall of Jolene's apartment for 11 minutes before getting up and making coffee she did not want. She found the cabin in the paperwork on a Thursday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Wren was asleep on the floor, surrounded by her usual debris field of plastic figurines and crayon stubs. Jolene was watching something on her laptop with headphones on her mouth, moving occasionally in silent commentary on whatever she was seeing. The apartment was as quiet as it ever got, which was not very, but quiet enough for Clara to spread the folder of documents across the coffee table and go through them again. Not for any specific reason, only because going through them felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than the alternative, which was sitting still and letting the weight of her situation press down on her, the way the November sky pressed down on the city outside the window. She almost missed it. The property transfer document from her grandmother's estate was a single sheet folded into thirds, tucked behind the asset disclosure summary, where she had placed it 4 years ago and never looked at again. She unfolded it slowly smoothing the creases with the side of her hand. Her grandmother, Margaret's signature was at the bottom. The handwriting small and precise and slightly slanted, the way people wrote when they had learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a preference. Clara read it twice, then held it under the lamp on the end table beside Jolene's couch. Cabin and associated parcel, Blue Ridge Foothills, Hardy County, Virginia. Transfer of title, sole ownership, Clara Jean Mercer Nee Calloway. Date of transfer, March 14th, 11 years prior. She sat with the paper in her hands and felt something she had not felt in several weeks. Not hope exactly, something smaller and more cautious than hope. The sensation of a door that might not be locked. She remembered the cabin the way you remembered something you had visited once as a child and never returned to. Her grandmother had taken her there the summer Clara was 9. A long drive into the mountains that felt like driving out of the world she knew and into something older and quieter and less concerned with the things she had been taught to care about. The cabin was small, even then, tucked into the side of a hill, under a canopy of trees so thick the sunlight came through in pieces. Her grandmother had called it her thinking place. She had said it with a particular kind of pride, the way people spoke about things they had earned rather than been given. Clara had not been back in 32 years. She did not know what condition it was in. She did not know if it was standing. She knew it was hers legally and completely overlooked in the divorce proceedings, because $1 was not a number that commanded attention from attorneys who billed by the hour. She told Jolene the next morning over coffee. Jolene's response was immediate and delivered in the tone she reserved for things she found both absurd and concerning. A cabin, Clara confirmed. In the mountains, in the foothills technically, Western Virginia. Jolene set down her mug. Honey, I say this with love. If that place is worth $1, it is probably held together with good intentions and old prayers. Clara wrapped her hands around her own mug, feeling the warmth against her palms. I know. Do you even know if it is standing? I do not know anything about it. I have not been there since I was 9. Jolene looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone performing a rapid internal calculation. The kind of calculation that weighed friendship against practicality and tried to determine which one weighed more. And you are thinking about going? I am thinking it is mine, Clara said, which is more than I can say about anything else right now. Jolene did not argue further. She was a practical woman, and she understood, even if she did not say so, that $47 and a couch in someone else's apartment was a specific kind of bottom, and that specific kinds of bottoms required specific kinds of action, even when those actions looked from the outside like terrible ideas. The news reached Garrett through a mutual acquaintance 3 days later, as news always found its way in the social geography they had shared for a decade. Clara did not know how he had heard. She did not particularly care. What she cared about was what Jolene told her. He had said relayed secondhand with the barely contained pleasure Jolene took in delivering information she felt confirmed her general assessment of Garrett as a person. He laughed. Jolene said, setting plates on the table with the pointed efficiency of someone who wanted Clara to hear the next part clearly. When he heard you were driving to Virginia to look at a shack your grandmother left you. He apparently said, and I am quoting here, because the exact words matter, good luck with the outhouse. Clara ate her dinner without commenting. She was not a person who expressed anger loudly. She had learned over 11 years with a man who found emotional displays distasteful to feel things quietly and completely, to let them settle rather than scatter. She felt Garrett's laughter settle in her now. Not like a wound, like fuel, the kind that burns slow and clean. She left on a Saturday morning before dawn. Jolene had pressed 4 $20 bills into her hand the night before, claiming it was money she owed from a dinner they had shared months ago, which was not true, but was delivered with such conviction that arguing felt unkind. Wren had drawn her a picture of a cabin in the mountains. the crayon representation cheerful and slightly lopsided, with a sun in the corner that took up roughly a third of the page, and a figure outside the cabin that Wren identified as Clara, and that Clara thought looked more like a potato with arms, but which she folded carefully and put in her jacket pocket anyway. She drove a borrowed car. Jolene's 12-year-old Honda with a passenger window that would not roll all the way down, and a heat system that took 20 minutes to warm up in cold weather. It did not matter. She had 4 hours of road ahead of her and a thermos of coffee and the specific quiet determination of a woman who had decided that whatever she found at the end of that drive was going to be the beginning of something rather than the continuation of nothing. The drive took her south through Maryland and into the Virginia Panhandle, the landscape shifting gradually from the flat industrial corridors she knew into something that felt older, more deliberate. Hills began appearing where the land had been flat, rising at the edges of the highway like suggestions, like the land reminding itself that it had another shape it preferred. By the time she turned off the interstate, she was moving through country that had the quality of a place that did not need to be seen to continue existing. The trees were bare in late November, their branches making complicated patterns against a sky that was low and gray and indifferent. The GPS signal flickered twice on the county road and died completely on the secondary road, which was paved in name only, a length of cracked asphalt that narrowed steadily until it was barely wider than the car. She drove by memory and by handwritten directions she had pulled from a 40-year-old letter her grandmother had sent to her mother, discovered in a shoebox at the bottom of Clara's storage unit the night before she left. The directions were specific in the way that people wrote before GPS made specificity unnecessary. Look for the split trunk oak at the property line. The drive is gravel after that. Do not let the grade fool you, it is longer than it looks. The split trunk oak was still there. She almost missed it, slowing too late, the tires crunching on gravel as she turned. The drive curved up and to the left through trees that pressed close on both sides, close enough that the Honda's mirrors brushed branches. The grade was exactly as the letter described, deceiving in its angle, the incline flattening out just when it felt like it should be steepening. And then, between two large oaks that had grown toward each other and almost met overhead, the cabin appeared. Clara stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking through the windshield at what her grandmother had left her. It was standing. That was the first thing. It was standing, which was not a given, and which felt like a form of grace she had not expected to receive from a building that had been sitting alone in these mountains for God knew how many years without anyone to look after it. The structure was small, exactly as she remembered, and smaller than memory had allowed. The roof low and steep, and covered in moss that had spread from the edges inward in the patient way that living things claimed what they needed. The wood siding had gone silver gray with age and weather, not rotted, but weathered to a kind of dignity. The way old things sometimes looked more themselves the older they got. A stone chimney rose at the left end of the roof, its mortar gray and settled, its top scattered with a nest of something that had been abandoned before winter. But then Clara saw something that did not belong to abandonment. On the porch, stacked neatly against the railing, was firewood. Not the gray, cracked wood of years of weathering. This wood was cut clean, the ends still pale, some of the bark still carrying the faint green of living cambium beneath it. Someone had been here, recently, within the last few weeks. She turned off the engine and got out. The cold hit her immediately sharper here than it had been in Harrisburg. The mountain air carrying a bite that was specific to elevation, drier and thinner and cleaner than the air she had been breathing for weeks in Jolene's apartment. She stood in the gravel drive and listened. Nothing moved. There were no cars on the road below. No planes overhead. No sounds from neighboring properties, because there were no neighboring properties. Not for another mile in any direction, according to the county parcel map she had pulled up at the library before she left. Just trees and the distant sound of water somewhere below the property line, and the specific silence of a place that had been left alone long enough to forget it had ever been occupied. But the firewood on the porch said otherwise. She walked toward the cabin slowly, not from caution exactly, but from something she could not quite name. Awareness, the heightened attention of a person entering a space where the evidence contradicted the expectation. The grass around the cabin was long and brown and flattened in places by winter. The stone path from the drive to the front door was barely visible under it. She found the path by feel, following the slight hardness beneath her feet, and stepped up onto the porch. Near the stack of new firewood in the thin layer of frost that had formed on the porch boards overnight, she saw them. Boot prints, large ones, a man's size 11 or 12. They went from the steps to the woodpile and back. They were not old. The frost had preserved their edges but had not filled them in completely. 2 days old at most, maybe less. Clara stood on the porch of her grandmother's cabin, looking at the boot prints of a stranger who had been here before her, and felt two things simultaneously. The first was fear, which was rational, and which she acknowledged without letting it make her decisions. The second was something harder to name: curiosity. The particular variety of curiosity that arose when the evidence in front of you did not match any explanation you had available. She tested each porch board before committing her weight. They held solid enough, slightly soft in one spot near the left railing, where water had found its way in over the years, but not structurally compromised. The railing itself leaned outward at an angle that suggested it was functioning more as a suggestion than a support at this point. She held it anyway lightly and looked out from the porch at the view her grandmother had chosen this place for. It stopped her breath. The hill dropped away below the cabin in a long, gradual slope through bare trees, and at the bottom of the valley, a creek ran gray and silver in the November light, winding between rocky banks before it turned at the far edge and disappeared behind a ridge. Beyond the ridge, the mountains rose in layers, each one a slightly different shade of gray and blue, fading as they got farther away until the farthest ones were barely distinguishable from the sky. The view was enormous and quiet and completely indifferent to her presence, which was, she realized, the point. This was not a view that needed to be earned. It was simply there the way mountains were there, without condition or expectation. And standing in front of it, Clara understood for the first time why her grandmother had called this place what she had called it, a thinking place. Because a view like this did not ask you to be anything. It only asked you to look. She found the key on a nail under the porch railing, where her grandmother's letter had said it would be covered in rust, but functional, and unlocked the front door. The inside smelled like time. That was the only way she could describe it later. Not mustiness, exactly. Not the sharp smell of mold or damp, but something deeper and quieter. The smell of a space that had been sealed away from the world for years and had been slowly becoming more itself in the silence. The air was cold, colder inside than out, in the particular way that old, uninsulated structures trapped cold and held it still and dark. She found the light switch by feel and flipped it, expecting nothing. The overhead light came on. A single bare bulb in a ceramic socket mounted to the ceiling beam. Its light yellow and inadequate and somehow wonderful. She stood in the doorway and stared at it. The power was on. She had not expected that. A cabin abandoned for 11 years does not typically maintain an active electrical account. Someone was paying this bill. Someone had been maintaining this connection. The boot prints, the firewood, the electricity. She stepped inside and took stock, slowly moving her eyes around the space the way her father had taught her to enter an unfamiliar room, taking the whole thing in before zeroing in on details. The cabin was one main room, maybe 20 feet by 18. A stone fireplace dominated the left, matching the chimney she had seen from outside. The floor was wide plank pine gray, with age worn in the paths that people had walked for decades. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, plain and heavy, the kind built to last, rather than to be admired, with 2 chairs pushed under it. Against the far wall was a kitchen area, a cast-iron stove that looked older than the cabin, a short counter, a single deep sink with a hand pump mounted above it. To the right, a doorway led to what appeared to be the only other room, small enough to be a closet, sized to be a bedroom. Everything was covered in dust. Not the casual dust of a few months, but the deep, settled dust of years, lying in layers on every horizontal surface, softening the edges of things, making the whole room feel like it existed just slightly out of focus. But nothing was destroyed. Nothing had been vandalized or damaged beyond what time and weather had done on their own schedule. The walls were solid. The ceiling showed one dark stain in the far corner, where water had found its way through, but the wood around it was dry. The fireplace screen was rusted but upright. Clara stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, completing a full circle. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The feeling that a space belonged to her. Not because she had decorated it or renovated it or made it match the image she had built in her mind over years of magazine pages and Pinterest boards, but because it was hers by inheritance, by blood, by the simple fact that her grandmother had chosen to leave it to her and no one else. She tested the hand pump over the sink, working the handle in long strokes until it coughed and complained and finally produced a thin stream of brownish water that gradually cleared to pale yellow. And then, after 2 minutes of steady pumping, ran cold and clear. There was a well. The well was working. She checked the small bedroom. A narrow iron bed frame with no mattress. A wooden dresser with 3 drawers and a mirror mounted above it. Its silvering gone brown and cloudy with age. The dresser drawers held linens folded with the precise creases of a woman who had known how to fold things properly, and had done so even for objects that would sit alone in a mountain cabin for years. The sheets were yellowed, but unrotted. The wool blankets slightly moth-eaten at the corners, but whole. She pulled the blankets out and shook them over the porch railing, watching the dust rise in a cloud and drift away down the hill. By the time she finished the initial survey, the light had shifted from the flat gray of midday to the slightly warmer gray of early afternoon, which was as close to sun as the November sky was prepared to offer. She made a list on a notepad she had brought, old habit from her working years, from the version of herself who had managed projects with spreadsheets and color-coded folders. The list was not short. The roof needed inspection. The windows needed work. The porch needed boards replaced. The well needed testing. But underneath all of that, running through the list like a current she kept returning to, was the basic and sustaining fact. The structure was sound. She could see it in the way the doors hung. She could feel it in the floors. The stone foundation was solid mortared, well, the kind of work done by someone who expected it to last, rather than someone who expected it to be replaced. It could be livable. That was the thought she turned over carefully, the way you turned something fragile, aware of its weight and its potential to break. With work, real work, sweat and patience, and no budget for contractors' work. It could be livable, and livable was a thing she needed to be. She lit the fireplace that evening using the fresh wood from the porch. It caught quickly and burned clean, and the light changed the room immediately, made it smaller and warmer and more particular, gave the shadows depth and the surfaces something to reflect. She sat at the wooden table with her notepad and her list and her thermos of cooling coffee, and she made plans the way she had always made plans when the world went sideways. Methodically, one item at a time, refusing to let the size of the whole picture paralyze the next individual step. She slept that first night wrapped in her grandmother's wool blankets on the floor near the fireplace, because the bedroom was colder than the main room, and she had not brought a sleeping pad. The pine boards were hard beneath her hip and shoulder. The fire ticked and settled as it burned down. The cabin made the small sounds that old structures made at night, the contracting of wood as the temperature dropped, the faint settling of stone against stone in the chimney. She slept better than she had in 3 months. She woke to the sound of something she could not immediately place. A low rhythmic sound from somewhere outside. She lay still for a moment in the dark, with the fireplace down to embers, listening with her whole body. The sound resolved itself into wind moving through the trees, a particular pattern created by the shape of the hillside, channeling the air in a way that made it sound almost deliberate, almost like something breathing. She lay there in the dark and thought about her grandmother. Margaret Calloway had been born in 1929 in a small town in West Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner who died young and a mother who raised 3 children through the Depression, with a combination of garden vegetables, ordered labor, and a quiet, iron-willed certainty that circumstances were not destiny. Margaret had come out of that childhood the way some people came out of fire. Not unmarked, but unbent. She had moved to Pennsylvania in the early 1950s, married Clara's grandfather, a machinist who loved her steadily and without drama for 44 years until he died. She had worked at the county library for 30 years. She had kept her own books, her own garden, her own counsel. She had never spoken about money directly. This was a generational thing, and also a Margaret thing. A belief that finances were private in the way that certain griefs were private. Not because they were shameful, but because they were personal. What Clara knew about her grandmother's financial situation was what she had observed. The house was always warm. The pantry was always full, and Margaret never appeared to want for anything, while also never appearing to indulge. She drove the same car for 21 years. She wore shoes until they wore through. She gave gifts that were exactly right and never extravagant. What Clara had not known, what no one had known or thought to ask, was what Margaret had done with her money over those decades. Whether she had spent it or saved it or put it into something else entirely. Clara had not thought about this once in 11 years. She thought about it now, lying in the dark of the cabin her grandmother had called her thinking place, listening to the wind moving through the trees, and she felt the thoughts settle in a way that was not yet particular enough to be called a suspicion. It was more like a question forming in the space where a question had never been needed before. A question about what her grandmother had meant by this place, what she had meant by leaving it specifically to Clara, what she had meant by the word thinking, and whether thinking was all she had done here. She fell back to sleep before she could follow the question anywhere useful. In the morning, she found the trapdoor. It was not hidden exactly. It was not behind a panel or beneath a rug or under any surface that required specific knowledge to locate. It was in the floor of the small bedroom, visible the moment she moved the iron bed frame aside to check the condition of the boards underneath which she was doing, methodically checking each plank for soft spots, the way she had been checking everything in this cabin, with the patience of someone who could not afford to miss things, with the attention of someone who had recently learned what missing things could cost. The trapdoor was there when the frame moved, a square cut in the floorboards, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, with a simple iron ring set flush into the wood as a handle. The cut was clean and deliberate, the edges fitted tightly. It did not look like something added after the fact. It looked like something that had been designed to be there. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Her first thought was practical. Root cellar. Mountain cabins built before refrigeration often had root cellars, spaces beneath the floor for storing vegetables and preserved foods through winter. It would make sense. It would be entirely ordinary. It was probably a root cellar. She bent down and took hold of the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, solid wood with a ledge on the underside that let it seat cleanly in the frame. It came up smoothly. The hinges on the far side moved without the protest she had expected from hardware that old. They did not screech. They did not resist. They moved the way hinges moved when someone had oiled them recently, because old hinges that had not been used did not move like that. They seized, they fought, they announced themselves. These moved like hinges that someone had maintained within the last several years. Someone who understood that a door closed was only useful if a door could also be opened. Someone who had been coming here and doing this maintenance on a schedule. The boot prints on the porch, the firewood, the electricity, the oiled hinges. Below the trapdoor was darkness and a set of wooden steps and a smell that came up toward her in the cold morning air of the cabin. Not the smell of vegetables or preserved food or the particular earthiness of a root cellar. Something different, drier, older. The smell of a space that had been sealed and kept deliberately. The way a room smelled when it had been protecting something for a long time. Clara crouched at the edge of the opening and shone her phone's flashlight down. The steps descended 8 or 9 feet into a space that was wider than a root cellar had any reason to be. She could see the edge of a wall at the bottom. Stone, carefully laid. Not the rough field stone of a hasty cellar, but fitted and mortared work that matched the quality of the chimney outside. The light reached only so far. The space beyond was dark. The air coming up from below was cold and still, and carried that particular smell of deliberate preservation. She sat with her hand on the iron ring and felt that cautious, careful thing stir again in her chest. The thing that was not yet hope, but was moving in that direction. The question that had been forming in the dark last night, becoming more particular, now more pointed, less comfortable. She put her phone between her teeth for the light and took hold of the top step and began to climb down. The steps were solid, 9 of them, each one wide enough for a full footstep and deep enough that she did not have to grip the rough-cut railing on her right to keep her balance. She counted them as she descended the way she had been counting everything since the divorce, measuring and cataloging and building the habit of inventory from whatever she had left. 9 steps. The temperature dropped as she went lower. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The particular cold of Earth doing what Earth always did, holding its own steady temperature regardless of what the seasons were doing above. She reached the bottom and stood and raised her phone and swept the light slowly left to right. The space was not a root cellar. She swept the light again more slowly this time, making herself process what she was seeing rather than react to it. The room was perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Its walls, dressed stone, fitted with the mortar between courses, clean and gray and old. The floor was packed earth-dry, covered in several places by rough wooden boards laid as walkways. The ceiling was low enough that she stood with only inches to spare the floor joists of the cabin above her visible through rough planking. A single bare bulb hung from a wire stapled along the ceiling with a pull string hanging down. She reached for it, already half certain nothing would happen. The light came on. She stood in the sudden yellow brightness and looked at what her grandmother had kept below her thinking place. The walls of the room were lined with shelving, the same plain pine board construction as the kitchen cabinets above, built to the same unpretentious standard. Functional, solid, built to hold weight. The shelves were holding weight. She could see that from where she stood. The way the boards bowed slightly at their centers under what was stacked and arranged along their length. The objects on the shelves were varied in size and form, but they were packed with the density of a person who understood that space was not to be wasted, that every inch was an argument, and she was making hers with both hands. Clara moved closer. The first section of shelving held mason jars, dozens of them, the wide-mouth quart variety that her grandmother had used for as long as Clara could remember. But these were not filled with tomatoes or pickled beans or summer corn. They were filled with coins, old coins. She could see even at a glance. The kind that came in different colors than the currency she used every day. Some with a dull copper shine, others with the particular warmth of old gold, others still in silver that had toned to gray rather than the bright finish of modern quarters. The jars were labeled in Margaret's handwriting, the small, precise letters pressed into strips of masking tape affixed to each lid. The labels were dates and categories. To 1910, Morgan's. 1913 to 1933, Barber's. She traced the labels slowly with one finger, reading them like a map of time. She did not know coins. She had never owned a coin collection, never attended a coin show,
never thought about old coins as anything other than the spare change you found in jacket pockets. But she understood the weight of the jars,
the deliberateness of the organization, the fact that a woman who did nothing without purpose had stored these with care and labeled them with precision. She understood that purpose and care applied to objects usually meant those objects were worth caring about. She kept moving along the shelves. The next section held something different. Flat wooden trays, perhaps a dozen of them stacked carefully with squares of felt between each one. She lifted the top tray and opened the felt. Inside were stamps, postage stamps, rows of them mounted on backing paper, each one separated from the next by a layer of transparent protective sleeve. She could read the dates printed on them and understand that anything printed in 1869 and housed with this level of deliberate care was being treated as something precious. The third section held works on paper, carefully interleaved with acid-free tissue, stored flat in large, shallow boxes sealed at their edges with tape. She opened the top box gently and lifted one corner of the tissue. The paper beneath was cream-colored with age, the ink on it dense and precise, a print of some kind. A landscape rendered in lines and shadow that had a quality she had only seen in museum rooms. And against the far wall, in the deepest shadow of the cellar, 6 wooden crates, sealed, unlabeled. The only things in the entire room that Margaret had chosen not to annotate. That absence of labels felt significant in the way all of her grandmother's choices felt significant once you understood that she was a woman who had done very little without reason. Clara counted everything she could see without opening anything further. 28 mason jars of coins, 14 trays of stamps, 9 flat boxes of works on paper, 6 sealed wooden crates. She sat down on the packed earth floor of the cellar, which she had not planned to do. She sat down because her legs required it, because the scope of what she was looking at had arrived in her body before it had arrived in her mind, and her body needed a moment to receive it. She sat on the floor and looked at the room from that angle. The shelves running the full perimeter, except for the stairs and a rough-built workbench against the far wall she had not noticed yet. Every inch of shelving occupied. The yellow light from the single bulb, casting long shadows behind the jars and the trays and the boxes and the crates. All of it silent and still and patient, all of it waiting, the way it had been waiting for 11 years, the way Margaret had built it to wait. A quiet life, a librarian's salary, a car driven for 21 years, shoes worn through, and this beneath a $1 cabin in the Virginia mountains, full of things that someone had spent a lifetime collecting and preserving and organizing with the same discipline she had brought to every other part of her life. Clara pressed her hands flat against the cold earth floor and thought about Garrett, about his attorneys with their precise language and their asset disclosure summaries, about the house in Chestnut Hill and the car and the $47 she had driven here with, about the way he had laughed when someone told him she was going to look at a cabin worth $1. She did not laugh. She was not the kind of woman who laughed at her own good fortune, not because she took it for granted, but because she understood instinctively that the moment had a gravity that deserved better than laughter. This was not a punchline. This was the answer to a question she had not known she was asking, delivered by a woman who had been dead for 11 years and who had known somehow that Clara would need it. She went back upstairs. She needed air. She needed to think. She stood on the porch in the cold November afternoon and looked at the mountains and breathed and let her mind work through what she had found without trying to force it into conclusions it was not ready for. She was still standing there 20 minutes later when she heard the engine. It came from below, from the direction of the county road. A vehicle climbing the gravel drive. The sound of tires on loose stone and the low rumble of a truck engine working against the grade. Coming toward the cabin. Clara's body went rigid. She had no weapon, no phone signal, no neighbor within a mile. She was a woman alone in the mountains with a cellar full of things she did not understand, and someone was driving up to her door. The truck appeared through the trees. An old Ford pickup, dark blue, its bed loaded with split firewood and what looked like a toolbox, and several plastic containers of something she could not identify from the porch. It came around the last curve and stopped when the driver saw the Honda parked in front of the cabin. The engine idled for a moment. Then it cut off. A man got out. I was in his late 60s, maybe older, with the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life working outdoors. Not tall, not imposing, but solid in the way that people were solid when their bodies had been shaped by use rather than by exercise. He wore work boots size 11 or 12. Clara noticed immediately, and a canvas jacket that had been repaired more than once, and a cap that he removed as he looked at her on the porch. He looked at the Honda. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Clara. Then he said something she did not expect. "You look like her." Clara kept her hands at her sides. She did not step back, but she did not step forward. "Who are you?" "My name is Ray Hoskins. I am the man your grandmother hired to look after this place." He said it simply, without elaboration, without the kind of justification that people offered when they knew their presence required explaining. He said it the way people said things that were simply true and did not need decoration. Clara looked at his boots, looked at the fresh firewood in his truck bed that matched the fresh firewood on the porch, looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who worked with wood, a carpenter's hands. "My grandmother has been dead for 11 years, Clara said. "I know," Ray Hoskins said. "She hired me 14 years ago, 3 years before she passed. Paid me up front through 2030. Gave me a list of what she wanted done and when she wanted it done and how she wanted it done. I have followed that list to the letter for 14 years. He paused. She was a very specific woman. Clara felt something shift in her understanding. The electricity, the oiled hinges, the firewood. Not mysterious, not threatening, maintained, cared for, on a schedule, by a man her grandmother had hired and paid and trusted with the one thing she seemed to have trusted no one else with. "What was on the list?" Clara asked. "Keep the power connected. Oil the hinges on the bedroom floor once every spring. Stack firewood on the porch every fall. Check the roof after storms. Keep the drive clear enough to pass. And one more thing. He looked at her directly. If anyone from the family comes, help them. If no one comes before 2030, contact the County Conservation Trust about the land. Clara stood on the porch processing this. Her grandmother had planned for the possibility that no one would come, had planned for the possibility that the cabin and everything beneath it would pass out of the family entirely. Had set a deadline, 2030, 4 more years from now. But she had also planned for this, for Clara. Standing on this porch, finding what was below. She made a decision. She stepped forward. She extended her hand. Ray Hoskins took it. His grip was dry and firm and brief. "Come inside," she said. "I need to ask you something." They sat at the wooden table. Clara made coffee from her thermos, the last of it, and poured it into 2 of the mismatched cups she had found in the kitchen cabinet. Ray held his cup without drinking. He had the patience of a man who had spent decades working with materials that could not be rushed. Wood and stone, and the particular timeline of mountain weather. "Do you know what is in the cellar?" Clara asked. "I know there is a cellar," Ray said. "I have never been down there. Your grandmother was clear about that. Family only. I oil the hinges because she asked me to. I do not go below." Clara studied his face. She had spent 11 years married to a man who lied with the precision of an attorney drafting a contract. She had learned at significant cost what dishonesty looked like when it was wearing a professional face. Ray Hoskins was not wearing a professional face. He was wearing the face of a man telling the truth because lying required more energy than he was willing to spend. "There is something else," Ray said. He set his cup down and looked at her with the directness of someone about to deliver information he had been carrying for a while. "There is a man in town, a dealer in antiques and old things. His name is Victor Teague. He has asked me about this cabin twice in the past year. Asked if anyone had come up here. Asked if I knew what the Calloway woman kept on the property." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "I told him nothing, because there was nothing to tell, and because your grandmother told me specifically that if anyone came asking about the cabin, I was to say nothing and remember their name. So I said nothing, and I remembered his name." He paused. The fire she had built that morning was burning low in the stone fireplace. The cabin was quiet around them in the way that mountain places were quiet. Not empty. Full of the particular silence that came from being far enough away from everything else that the only sounds remaining were the ones the world made on its own. "I will tell you what I know about Victor Teague," Ray said. "He has been dealing in antiques in the Shenandoah Valley for 30 years. He has a reputation for knowing more about what things are worth than the people who own them. And he has a reputation for using that knowledge to his advantage rather than theirs. Your grandmother did business with him for a time. I know this because she mentioned it once. She said she stopped because he looked at things the wrong way.
What does that mean?
Clara asked. Ray shrugged, the shrug of a man who did not deal in abstractions. She said he looked at things and saw what they could get him, not what they were. She said that was not the same thing as knowing value. Clara sat with this. She sat with the boot prints and the firewood and the oiled hinges and the cellar full of her grandmother's lifetime of careful work. She sat with the name Victor Teague and the knowledge that someone out there knew about this cabin and was interested in what it contained. She understood something she had not understood an hour ago. She was not simply a woman who had found something valuable. She was a woman who needed to protect something valuable. And those were two very different positions requiring two very different kinds of attention. She looked at Ray Hoskins across the table, a man her grandmother had trusted enough to pay for 14 years of service, a man who had oiled hinges and stacked firewood and kept the power on without once going below the floor. A man who had carried a dead woman's instructions for over a decade because he had given his word. She made another decision, the kind of decision she had been learning to make since the divorce, the kind that came from the gut and was confirmed by the mind rather than the other way around. Ray, she said, I am going to be staying here for a while. I have some work to do, and I need to do it carefully, and I need to do it without anyone knowing about it, especially Victor Teague. Ray nodded once, the compact nod of a man who found that statement sufficient. Your grandmother, he said, would have said the same thing exactly that way. He finished his coffee. He stood. He put his cap back on. At the door he paused and looked back at her. I will bring more firewood Thursday, he said. And I will keep my ears open in town. If Teague asks about this place again, I will let you know. Then he walked to his truck and drove back down the gravel drive and disappeared into the trees, and Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched the dust from his tires settle in the November air and felt for the first time since the divorce that she was not alone. Not in the way she had been alone on Jolene's couch. Not in the way she had been alone in the courthouse hallway. But in a different way. The way you were alone when you had something worth protecting and someone you could trust to help you protect it, and the specific quiet determination that came from understanding that the next part of your life was going to be built, not from what someone else had given you or taken from you, but from what had been waiting for you in the dark beneath a $1 cabin in the Virginia mountains. Clara went inside. She closed the door. She added a log to the fire and sat at the wooden table with her notepad and the inventory she had started, and the long list of things she needed to do, and the longer list of things she did not yet understand. She wrote one line at the bottom of the page and underlined it twice the way her grandmother had underlined important things. Do not rush this. This is the beginning. The fire crackled. The mountain held its cold and its quiet around the cabin. Somewhere below in the valley, the creek kept talking, and beneath the bedroom floor, in the yellow light of a single bare bulb, 28 mason jars and 14 trays and 9 boxes and 6 sealed crates sat on their shelves in the dark and waited with the patience of things that had been built to outlast everyone who had ever underestimated them. She spent the first 2 weeks in the cellar the way her grandmother had apparently spent 40 years above it. Slowly, methodically, without allowing the size of what she was looking at to overwhelm the discipline required to understand it. She developed a routine. She woke before dawn, built the fire in the stone hearth, pumped water for the kettle, and made tea from a tin of loose leaf she had found in the kitchen cabinet that still carried a faint ghost of bergamot despite its age. She ate breakfast from the cooler of food she had packed, rationing it carefully because the nearest grocery store was 20 minutes down the mountain, and every trip meant fuel she could not easily afford. Then she went below. She worked in the cellar for 5 or 6 hours at a stretch, photographing and cataloging with the notepad and the phone that became her primary tools. She developed a system. Each shelf got a section number. Each item on each shelf got a line entry with a physical description, the text of any label in Margaret's handwriting, and the number of photographs she had taken of it. She was building the inventory the way she had once built project plans at the manufacturing firm outside Philadelphia, with columns and categories and the particular satisfaction that came from imposing order on complexity. She opened the mason jars one at a time, beginning at the left end of the first shelf, working methodically to the right, in the order her grandmother had arranged them. The coins inside each jar were not loose. They were sleeved, each one in its own small plastic holder, stacked in columns within the jar, with the care of someone who understood that contact and friction were enemies of preservation. She lifted the first one and held it to the bare bulb's light. The profile of a woman she did not recognize on a field that had darkened with age to the deep, warm brown of old leather. She photographed it. She photographed each jar. She worked with the patience she had been rebuilding in herself over the past 3 months. The patience that unemployment and rejection and sleeping on someone else's couch had stripped away, and which she was now reconstructing from what was available. Her phone battery ran low at the end of the second day in the cellar. She drove 20 minutes to a gas station to charge it, sitting in the parking lot for 40 minutes, watching truckers come and go, her notepad in her lap, adding to her inventory while the phone charged from the car's outlet. She felt slightly absurd and completely focused, which was a combination she had forgotten was possible. She started the online research at that gas station and returned to it every time she needed to charge. She learned what she needed to learn in sessions that stretched across hours in the parking lot with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous administration. She learned that the Morgan silver dollars her grandmother had labeled in the mason jars were among the most widely collected American coins, that their value varied enormously based on year, mint mark, and condition, that the best preserved specimens in certain key dates were worth thousands of dollars each. She learned that the term barber referred to coins designed by Charles E. Barber, the chief engraver of the United States Mint, from 1879 to 1917. and that the barber quarters and dimes and half dollars from the 1890s and early 1900s that Margaret had catalogued were exactly the kind of coins that serious collectors spent decades pursuing. She learned that the numismatic world had a specific geography, that there were major auction houses that handled collections of consequence, that there were regional dealers with established reputations who could provide preliminary assessments, and that there was a protocol for this kind of thing, a correct sequence that protected the seller as much as the buyer if you followed it carefully and did not let impatience or desperation make your decisions for you. She was not going to let impatience or desperation make her decisions. She had already made that mistake, and it had cost her a house and a car and 11 years, and she was not going to make it again. On the fourth morning, she started the wooden crates. She brought the first one up from the cellar and set it on the kitchen table because the table was solid and wide, and because she needed to do this in the light of the main room. With the fire and the view through the window and all the ordinary steadiness of the cabin around her. The crate was pine built simply, its lid secured with 4 flathead screws she removed with a screwdriver from the small toolkit in her car. The lid came off cleanly. Inside, packed in acid-free tissue paper that had yellowed slightly with age, but maintained its function, were coins. Not in mason jars this time. These were in individual hard plastic cases, the kind she had seen in her online research. The kind used by professional grading services. Each case had a label with numbers and letters she could now partially read. The coin type, the date, the grade. She picked up the first one and tilted it toward the window. The coin inside was gold. She knew it immediately. The color, unmistakable. Not the brassy yellow of gold tone finish, but the particular warm, deep, dense yellow of actual gold. The color that explained why people had organized entire economies around this metal for thousands of years. The coin was larger than a quarter its surfaces, showing a woman with a torch raised above her head on one face and an eagle with spread wings on the other. She turned it carefully in its case, reading the label. St. Gaudens Double Eagle, 1908, MS 65. She set it down on the table and stood back. At the gas station that afternoon, she found a numismatic grading guide. MS 65 was a mint state grade. Gem uncirculated, one of the highest grades a coin could receive. The coin she had been holding had never been used as currency. It had been preserved at or near its original mint state for over 100 years. She found a price guide. She read the number and set the phone down on the dashboard. An 18-wheeler idled 30 feet away. A teenager held the door open for his grandmother. The particular ordinary world of a Tuesday afternoon in rural Virginia continued around her without any knowledge of what was sitting in a cellar 12 miles away. There were 42 coins in the first crate, each one graded, each one labeled. The second crate held more graded coins, silver and gold. The third crate held pocket watches. 6 of them each in its own padded case. each one antique in the way of things made before mass production made craft unnecessary. The fourth crate held silver, a tea service, flatware, a lion passant on the base of each piece, English sterling. The fifth crate held paper, not prints, but documents. Letters, receipts, correspondence from dealers and auction houses. Records of what appeared to be a lifetime of quiet strategic acquisition. Margaret had not merely collected these things, she had bought them deliberately across decades, and she had kept the records of every purchase with the orderly care she brought to everything. She opened the sixth crate on the Sunday of her second week. She had saved it deliberately. Some instinct told her it was different. The sixth crate had been placed at the very back of the cellar against the far wall, under the only section of shelving that was empty, as if it were separate, as if it belonged to a different category entirely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, and then in layers of acid-free tissue, and then in a box within the box, was a book. Not a printed book. A manuscript, hand-lettered in ink that had browned with age on paper that was heavy and cream-colored and carried its years with the authority of things that had survived more than most. The cover was plain. No title embossed, no decoration, only the leather itself smooth and dark with handling over what must have been many generations of hands. She opened it gently and read the first line. She could not read the language. She recognized the script as something European, but could not place the period or the origin. What she could read was the date on the first page, written in numerals rather than words. 1521. She closed the book carefully, replaced it in its wrappings, and sat back against the cellar wall. 1521. That was 6 years after Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door at Wittenberg, 29 years after Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. The world in 1521 was a world in the process of becoming unrecognizable to itself. And somewhere in that world, someone had sat down and written this book, and it had survived 5 centuries to reach the cellar of a mountain cabin in Virginia, where a woman named Margaret Calloway had placed it under the empty shelf at the back of the room, as if even she did not entirely know what to do with it. Clara sat in the cellar a long time that evening, not cataloging, just sitting, letting the full scope arrive. The full weight of what had been waiting here. She went upstairs and built the fire and made dinner and sat at the table with the inventory growing in her notepad. She wrote one line at the bottom of the day's notes. She underlined it twice. I need an expert, more than one, and I need to move carefully. It was the next morning when Victor Teague came. She heard the car before she saw it. Not a truck like Ray's. Something quieter. Something with a tuned engine and good tires that handled the gravel drive with the ease of a vehicle that cost more than most people in this county earned in a year. A dark gray SUV appeared through the trees and parked behind the Honda and sat with its engine running for a moment before the driver cut it off. The man who got out was around 60. Tall, well-dressed, in the way that certain men were well dressed in rural Virginia, not formally, but expensively. Good boots, a waxed canvas jacket that was meant to look like workwear and cost 10 times what workwear cost. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more calculating. The handsomeness still there, but subordinate now to something behind the eyes that was always working. He looked at the cabin the way Garrett used to look at investment properties, assessing, calculating, determining what something was worth before he determined what he would offer for it. Clara stepped onto the porch. She did not invite him closer. "Can I help you?" He smiled. The smile was practiced, the kind that arrived on schedule rather than by impulse. "My name is Victor Teague. I have a shop in the valley, antiques and fine objects. I was a friend of your grandmother's." Clara kept her hands at her sides. The word friend sat in the air between them with the particular weight of a word that was doing more work than it was qualified for. "I did not know my grandmother had friends in the antique business." "Well," Teague said, stepping closer to the base of the porch steps without being invited to climb them. "We did business together for a number of years. She was a remarkable woman, very knowledgeable, very particular about what she collected. I was sorry to hear about her passing." "She passed 11 years ago," Clara said. "Yes," Teague said, and his smile adjusted itself slightly, acknowledging the implication without conceding anything. "I have been meaning to reach out to the family. When I heard that someone had come up to the property, I thought it was the right time." Clara looked at him. She looked at the way he stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands in the pockets of his expensive jacket, his eyes moving past her to the cabin door with the specific focus of a man who was not interested in the door, but in what was behind it.
She thought about Ray's words. He looks at things and sees what they can get him, not what they are. What can I do for you, Mr. Teague?
He shifted his weight. The smile became something slightly more honest, which meant it became slightly more predatory. "Well, I know your grandmother kept certain items on this property. We discussed her collection on several occasions. I know she had coins and stamps and various objects she had acquired over the years. I wanted to offer my services as an appraiser, as a potential buyer. I could save you a great deal of time and trouble." Clara felt something settle in her chest. The same instinct that had told her to open the 6th crate last. The instinct that recognized when someone was trying to set the terms of an exchange before the other party understood what they were exchanging.
What kind of offer did you have in mind? She said, not because she was interested, because she wanted to hear the number, because the number would tell her everything she needed to know about what Victor Teague thought she was.
He spread his hands, a gesture meant to convey openness and reasonableness, and which conveyed neither. "I would need to see what is here, of course. But based on my knowledge of your grandmother's interests and the types of items she typically acquired, I could offer a fair price for the collection as a whole. A single transaction, clean and simple." No need for multiple appraisals or auction fees, or the complications that come with selling items individually. He paused, let his eyes move to the cabin door again. I was thinking $200,000 for everything. The number landed in the space between them, because $200,000 for what was in that cellar was not a fair offer. It was not even a serious offer. It was a number designed for a person who did not know what she had. A number meant to take advantage of grief and ignorance, and the particular vulnerability of a woman who had recently lost everything and might be desperate enough to take the first number someone put in front of her. Victor Teague had just told Clara exactly who he was. She let the silence do the work that words would have done less efficiently. She let him stand at the bottom of the steps and watch the smile on his face slowly lose its certainty as the silence extended past the point where a grateful acceptance should have arrived. Then she said very calmly, I appreciate you coming by. I am not interested in selling anything at this time. Teague's expression shifted. The calculation behind his eyes became visible the way machinery became visible when you remove the housing. He was recalibrating, adjusting his estimate of who she was, and not liking the adjustment. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I want to be straightforward with you. Collections like your grandmother's, if they sit too long without proper care, they lose value. Coins tarnish. Paper deteriorates. The market moves. I am offering you a clean transaction at a fair price, and I would encourage you to consider it seriously. Clara stepped back from the railing. She put her hand on the cabin door. My grandmother kept this collection for 40 years without your help, Mr. Teague. I think it can survive a few more weeks without it. Thank you for coming. She went inside and closed the door. She stood behind it and listened to the silence, and then the sound of footsteps on gravel, and then the sound of the SUV starting and backing down the drive. She stood there until the sound of the engine faded completely and the mountain returned to its quiet, and the only sound remaining was the fire in the hearth and her own breathing. She called Ray that afternoon. He came, she said. Ray's voice was unsurprised. What did he offer? 200,000. A pause. For all of it. For all of it. Another pause. Then Ray said in the flat, measured voice of a man stating something he had known for a long time. Your grandmother stopped selling to him in 1998. She told me once that a greedy man will always come back. She said the only thing to do with a greedy man is to make sure he finds a closed door every time he comes. Clara looked out at the mountains. The late afternoon light was making them blue at their farthest edges. I need an appraiser, Ray. A real one. Someone who knows what they are looking at and who has no interest in buying it. She called Jolene that evening. She told her about Teague, told her she needed a specialist. I know someone, Jolene said. She said it with the ease of a woman who always knew someone. His name is Bernard Hale. He is retired now, but he used to work at Christie's. Authentication and valuation estate collections, mostly. He moved back to Pennsylvania 3 years ago. He is particular and he charges for consultations, but he is the real thing. How do you know him? He is Ren's godfather's college roommate. I know everyone eventually. You want his number? Yes. And Jolene, do not tell anyone why I am asking. She called Bernard Hale the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned decades ago that urgency and accuracy were rarely available at the same time and had made his choice accordingly. She explained herself carefully. Inherited property, collection of items that might be significant, professional assessment needed, discretion essential. He asked 3 questions. What categories of items? How she had come to own the property? Whether she could wait 4 weeks? She told him coins and stamps and works on paper and silver and timepieces and a manuscript she could not read. She told him the property had been her grandmother's. She told him 4 weeks was fine. I gave her a date and a fee and a set of guidelines for preserving and handling the items in the interim that confirmed in their specificity and their precision that she had found the right person. She used the 4 weeks. She used them the way her grandmother would have used them, methodically, without wasting a single day. She finished the complete photographic inventory. She continued her research at the gas station. She replaced the damaged porch boards with lumber from a hardware store outside town, cutting them to length with a circular saw she found in the small outbuilding behind the cabin. That outbuilding turned out to contain more than garden tools. A workbench, a collection of hand tools maintained with the same care as everything else Margaret had left, and a set of property surveys that told her for the first time the exact dimensions of what she owned. The parcel was larger than the cabin suggested, 4.5 acres. The cabin and its cleared area representing less than 1/4 of the land. The rest wooded hillside dropping toward the creek and rising to a ridge at the back. And at the far corner of the survey, marked with the note in Margaret's handwriting, added to the margin in pencil, a notation she did not immediately understand. Secondary structure, rear parcel. Survey mark R7. She filed it. She would come back to it. Right now, she had Bernard Hale arriving in 6 days, and she needed the documentation to be ready. Bernard Hale arrived at 9:53 on a Tuesday morning in a dark green sedan that came slowly up the gravel drive and stopped in front of the cabin. He got out with the careful movements of a man in his mid-70s who had learned that attention was a physical practice. He wore a coat built for function rather than impression, and carried a leather case that had clearly been used for its purpose for a very long time. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the view. He looked at Clara. Your grandmother chose well, he said. She did. She chose everything well. She led him inside, led him to the bedroom, lifted the trapdoor, held it open and gestured toward the steps below. Bernard Hale looked down into the cellar, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his leather case and took out a pair of cotton gloves. Let us start at the beginning, he said. They went down together. Bernard did not speak for the first 14 minutes. Clara timed it without meaning to. The inventory habit extending itself into seconds. He moved through the cellar with the unhurried deliberateness of a man for whom rushed conclusions were a professional insult, touching nothing until he had looked at it, looking at nothing until he had established its context. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, entirely neutral. Your grandmother was a collector. A pause. He turned to look at Clara. Not a collector in the highest sense. A collector in the informed, systematic sense. This is not accumulated over a weekend or from a single source. This represents decades of considered acquisition. I know. I found her purchase records. She started in the early 1960s, as far back as I can document. Bernard turned back to the shelves. She diversified. That is either instinct or knowledge. Based on the condition of what I am seeing, I am inclined toward knowledge. She worked at a library for 30 years, Clara said. Bernard turned again. The corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was its near neighbor. A librarian. Of course she was. He spent 3 hours in the cellar. He did not appraise anything. He was careful to be clear about that distinction. He was not here to give her numbers today. He was here to assess what categories they were dealing with and what the appropriate next steps were. They came back upstairs and sat at the wooden table. Clara made tea. Bernard set his notebook on the table and looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to dispense with preamble. I want to ask you something first. Are you in a financially difficult position right now? Yes. He nodded. Then he told her what he could tell her. The coins represented the most immediately quantifiable portion. Based on what he had seen, his preliminary estimate for the graded coin collection alone was in the range of $400,000 to $600,000. A numismatic specialist could put her higher. The stamps required a philatelic specialist. The works on paper required an art historian. The silver required a specialist in English hallmarks. The timepieces required a horologist. But the condition of everything was exceptional. There is one other matter, he said. The manuscript. He looked at her steadily. If the date is accurate, and if the document is genuine, then you are looking at something that belongs in a museum or a rare books auction, rather than in a preliminary estate valuation. He let that settle. Then he gave her a list of specialists he trusted. People who understood discretion. He told her to start with the coins. He told her to plan for months. At the door he paused. Your grandmother, did she know you would need this? Clara thought about the property transfer dated the year of her marriage. About the 11 years Margaret had lived after that. I think she was paying attention to how things were going, and she trusted that I would eventually be ready to find it. Bernard nodded once. Then he drove away. Clara stood in the cold and watched the mountains and understood that the next phase had begun. But before she called the first specialist, before she started the process, Bernard had outlined she needed to follow one more thread. The notation on the survey. Secondary structure. Rear parcel. Survey mark R7. She went to find it the next afternoon. She found the survey marker at the edge of a natural clearing in the trees about 300 yards from the cabin. The clearing was irregular, shaped by the trees around it, and at its center, almost invisible under 20 years of encroaching brush and vine, was a structure. Not a shed, not a lean-to, a building, small, perhaps 12 feet by 15, built from the same dressed stone as the cabin's foundation, with a door that was still plumb in its frame. The door was locked with a heavy iron padlock different from the lock on the cabin's front door. Older, secured with deliberateness. She already had the key. She had found it 2 days earlier at 5:14 in the morning, lying awake in the dark. She had remembered where to look with the sudden clarity that sometimes came in the space between sleep and waking. She had walked through the cold cabin to the kitchen and reached into the back of the cabinet with the cast iron past the skillet and the Dutch oven and the stack of pot lids, and her fingers had found it. A nail, and on the nail a key. The key fit the padlock perfectly. The lock opened with a clean snap, maintained like the hinges on the trapdoor. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The building was dark until she found the switch just inside the door. The light that came on was different from the bare bulb in the cellar. Warm and even. The kind of lighting that came from strips hidden behind wooden valances along the top of the walls. Indirect and diffuse. The kind specifically chosen to illuminate objects without damaging them. The walls were lined with insulation, faced with a pale, vapor-resistant material she recognized from her research as archival grade. The floor was sealed concrete rather than packed earth. A small dehumidifier sat in the far corner, its indicator light green running silently. Along one wall, suspended from horizontal bars mounted at ceiling height, were canvases. Not rolled, not boxed, hung carefully in a row, each one facing the wall, each one with the backing of acid-free board held in place by padded clips. She counted them. 9. She moved to the nearest one and lifted it from its bar and turned it around. A painting, oil on canvas, a landscape in the style of the American Hudson River School painters. She looked at the lower right corner for a signature. Found a name in thin brushstrokes. She checked the remaining 8. 6 had signatures. 2 had names she could not find on her phone. The 9th was unsigned entirely. But the thing that stopped her that afternoon was what she found on the back wall behind the paintings in a wooden cabinet she had overlooked, because it was the same pale material as the wall behind it, almost invisible. The cabinet held 6 composition notebooks, the standard black and white kind sold at every drugstore in America, arranged in chronological order. The first was dated 1963. The last was dated the year before Margaret died. Clara opened the first one. January 4. Attended the Pendleton estate sale in Moorfield. Purchased a set of coins from the administrator for $12. Morgan silver dollars, 6 of them condition good. The administrator knew nothing about grading. I said nothing useful to disabuse him of his assessment. This felt dishonest, and then I decided it was not dishonest, only accurate. He set the price. I paid it. She felt her grandmother's voice come through the ink. Direct, a little dry, entirely certain about the difference between honesty and obligation. The journals were not dramatic. They were written for the reason Margaret stated in the second entry. I need to keep records, or I will lose track of what I have, and what I paid for it, and what I believe it is worth. Records are how you know things over time. They are more reliable than memory and considerably cheaper than lawyers. 40 years of records. 40 years of purchases documented with the price paid, the seller's name, the condition assessment, and a running notation Margaret called my belief. Her private estimate of what an item was actually worth versus what she had paid. The gap between what she paid and what she believed was the engine of the entire collection. Clara read until she found the entry about Victor Teague. It was dated 1998. Teague came to pick up the pocket watch I sold him. He saw the small landscape in the workroom. He asked about it. I told him it was not for sale. He asked again. I told him again. He offered 3 times what I paid for it. I told him 3 times that it was not for sale. He left. I will not sell to him again. A man who comes back 3 times for something you have told him is not for sale is a man who believes persistence is the same as entitlement. It is not. Persistence is work. Entitlement is the belief that someone else's work belongs to you. Clara sat with that for a long time. Then she turned pages forward, looking for something she did not know she was looking for until she found it. The entry was dated 2 years into Clara's marriage. The words were different from the others. These were not about coins or stamps or paintings. I met Clara Mercer today at the house for Sunday dinner. Clara seems happy. Garrett talked about Clara's decision to leave her job as if it were a project milestone he had planned. He talked about their future the way a man talks about a company he is running. Not the way a man talks about a life he is sharing. I have been wrong about people before. I hope I am wrong about this. Clara turned the page. I am not wrong about this. I have watched him for a year now. He does not see her. He sees what she does for him. These are not the same thing. I transferred the cabin to Clara's name last year. I will keep building as if she will need a way out. I hope she will not need it. But hope is not a plan. Building is a plan. Clara closed the journal. She sat in the stone building surrounded by 9 paintings and 40 years of her grandmother's handwriting, and felt something she had not felt since the divorce. Not anger, not grief. The specific sensation of being seen by someone who was no longer alive. Of understanding that the most important relationship of her life had been conducted largely in silence by a woman who had watched and understood and built accordingly without ever saying a word. Margaret had known about Garrett, had known the way Clara was eventually going to need help, had spent the remaining years of her life building that help in a stone room on a hillside in Virginia, and waiting with the patience that was her defining quality for the day when Clara would come and find it. She locked the building. She went back to the cabin. She built the fire. She sat at the table. She called Jolene and told her the full scope. The cellar, the stone building, the journals, the paintings, the manuscript, the numbers Bernard had given her. She recounted it in the flat, organized way she had been training herself to discuss it without escalation. Because drama invited reactions she did not have the resources to manage. Jolene was quiet through the entire recounting. This was unusual. Then she said, "Elsa, your grandmother Margaret, yes, who drove the same car for 21 years, yes." "Nora," Jolene said, and her voice broke briefly before she collected it. She knew about Garrett before you did." Clara had thought about this, about the timing, about the 11 subsequent years. "She built me a way out," Clara said, "before I knew I needed one." Jolene cried, not loudly, because Jolene believed that crying loudly was a form of performance. She cried the way she did everything she took seriously, with full attention and without apology. And then the letter from Garrett's attorney arrived. It came by certified mail to the cabin address, which meant Garrett had found out where she was. The letter was precisely worded. It suggested that the cabin and its contents might be considered marital property, given that Clara had owned the cabin during the marriage and had therefore potentially accrued value in the property during the years they were together. It requested a full disclosure of any items of value found on the property. It suggested that failure to disclose could have legal consequences. Clara read it twice. She set it on the table. She picked up her phone and called Frances Nye. Frances Nye had 30 years of estate law experience. Clara had found her through a legal aid referral in the second week at the cabin before Bernard came, before the crates were opened, because Clara had learned from the most painful classroom available that having an attorney before you needed one was the difference between being prepared and being prey. Frances was not concerned by the letter. The property had been transferred to Clara by name before the marriage through Margaret's will. The collection had been purchased entirely with Margaret's funds over 40 years. The last documented purchase predated the marriage by 8 years. There was no legal basis for the claim, but Garrett escalated. He filed a motion with the court to freeze the property and its contents pending a review of the marital asset question. The motion required a hearing. The hearing required Clara to appear. She drove to the courthouse in the same borrowed Honda. She wore the same jacket she had worn every day for months. She carried a folder. In the folder were Margaret's journals, Margaret's purchase receipts, going back to 1963. The property transfer document dated 3 years before the marriage, and the complete inventory she had built over weeks of methodical work in the cellar and the stone building. Frances Nye stood beside her. But when the judge asked Clara to explain the provenance of the items in question, Clara spoke for herself. She had spent weeks learning the history of every object in that cellar. She had read 40 years of her grandmother's records. She knew the story because she had done the work of learning it herself, the way Margaret had done the work of acquiring them herself. Alone and without assistance, and without asking anyone's permission, she presented the evidence clearly. The timeline of purchases, the documentation of Margaret's independent funds, the property transfer predating the marriage, the 40 years of receipts in a dead woman's handwriting, proving that every item had been bought and paid for by someone who had never met Clara Mercer and who had never contributed $1 to or received $1 from the marital estate. The judge reviewed the documentation for 20 minutes. Then he dismissed Garrett's motion with a brevity that communicated everything the legal language did not. There was no basis for the claim. Garrett was in the courtroom. He sat in the second row behind his attorney, and he did not speak, and he did not look at Clara when the judge ruled. Clara looked at him, though. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at things since coming to the cabin, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, something else. Something about the way his certainty, which had always been his most prominent feature, seemed to have contracted. Left him looking like a man who had been wrong about something important and was only now beginning to understand how wrong. She walked out of the courthouse without speaking to him. She drove back to the cabin. She built the fire. She sat on the porch in the cold March air and watched the last of winter give way to the earliest suggestion of spring. The trees were still bare, but there was something in the quality of the light that said they would not be bare for long. Her phone rang the next week. Teague. She answered because she wanted to hear what he would say. Mrs. Mercer, he said. His voice had the careful modulation of a man recalibrating his approach. I believe I may have undervalued your grandmother's collection in my initial offer. I would like to propose a revised figure. $500,000 for everything. A clean transaction. Clara stood on the porch. She thought about Margaret's journal. A man who comes back 3 times for something you have told him is not for sale. Mr. Teague, Clara said, my grandmother stopped doing business with you 20 years ago. She had her reasons. I have read those reasons in her own handwriting, and I trust her judgment considerably more than I trust your revised figures. She paused. Do not call this number again. She hung up. She stood on the porch and felt something that had been sitting in her chest for months begin to loosen. Not dissolve. Loosen. The way a fist loosened when the thing it had been gripping was no longer something it needed to hold. She was done with Garrett's laughter and Teague's offers and the particular variety of man who looked at the world and saw only what things could get him. She needed the room they had been occupying. She needed it for what came next. She went inside. She sat at the table and opened her notebook and wrote at the top of a new page in the small, precise handwriting she had been developing over weeks of living in Margaret's place. "What happens next is mine to decide." She picked up the phone and called Bernard Hale and told him she was ready for the specialists. All of them, in whatever order he recommended. She would wait as long as it took. She would do this the way Margaret had built the collection. Carefully, without rushing, without letting anyone else set the terms. The specialists came one at a time over the months that followed, arriving at the cabin in vehicles that looked increasingly out of place on the narrow gravel drive. Each one summoned by Bernard through a network of professional relationships built over 4 decades of estate work. Each one vetted not only for expertise, but for discretion. Clara was not passive through any of it. She had decided that she was done being a woman who sat in rooms while other people determined the value of what belonged to her. She was going to learn what she had, the way Margaret had learned what she was buying. From the ground up, one category at a time, with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge acquired slowly was knowledge that stayed. The numismatic specialist arrived in mid-January. His name was Howard Ashe, a compact, deliberate man in his 60s with rimless glasses and steady hands. The steadiness of a surgeon or a jeweler or a man who understood that the objects he handled were irreplaceable and treated them accordingly. He spent 2 full days in the cellar. Clara went down with him both mornings. She asked questions, not the questions of a person trying to appear knowledgeable, the questions of a person genuinely building understanding. She asked about grading scales and what the numbers meant. She asked about mint marks and why a tiny letter on the face of a coin could multiply its value 10-fold. She asked about population reports and what it meant when a coin was one of 12 or one of 3 in a particular grade. Howard answered everything. He had the manner of a teacher who had long ago learned to distinguish between people who asked questions to fill silence and people who asked questions because they intended to use the answers. Clara was clearly the second kind. He held coins the way other people held newborns, with both certainty and reverence. He used a loop on a swing arm, studying surfaces with an attention so focused it seemed to alter the temperature of the room. Clara asked him about the St. Gaudens double eagle, the gold coin that had stopped her hands from being steady. "This is a strong 65, he said. "Possibly undergraded. The luster is full and unbroken. A coin like this has a very specific market. There are collectors who have spent 20 years looking for exactly this coin. When it appears at auction, they do not negotiate. They acquire." On the 4th day, he sat at the kitchen table and gave her numbers. The graded collection was worth between $750,000 and $900,000 at current market. He said conservatively 3 times. The ungraded coins in the mason jars would likely add another $200,000 to $300,000 after professional grading. Clara wrote the numbers in her notebook. She did not allow her hand to shake, though it wanted to. Over $1 million for the coins alone. She went inside and sat at the table, and thought about $12. 6 Morgan silver dollars from an estate sale in Moorfield in 1963. The seed from which everything had grown. The philatelic specialist came 3 weeks later. Her name was Caroline Voigt. She arrived with a briefcase and a magnifying loupe on a woven cord around her neck. She made a sound when Clara opened the first stamp tray. A brief intake of breath quickly controlled. The sound of expertise encountering something it had not expected to encounter in a cellar in the Virginia mountains. Clara had prepared for this visit. She now knew enough about philately to follow the conversation. She knew the difference between mint and used. She knew what centering meant. She had taught herself from the gas station parking lot the way her grandmother had taught herself from the county library. Knowledge was free if you had patience. Margaret had known this. Clara was learning it. The Curtis Jenny invert was in the 9th tray. Clara already knew what it was. The stamp depicted a biplane printed upside down on a 24-cent airmail stamp issued in 1918. An error that had transformed a piece of postage into one of the most valuable stamps in the world. Caroline confirmed it within an hour. The stamp was genuine. It was graded and certified from a previous assessment Margaret had arranged decades ago. A single example in this condition had sold at auction 3 years prior for just over $1.1 million. One stamp, purchased by Margaret for $300 in 1971 from a dealer in Baltimore. Worth more than the house Garrett had taken. Worth more than everything Garrett had taken combined. The total stamp collection Caroline estimated was worth between $1.4 and $1.9 million. The silver specialist came from Richmond in March. Georgian period. Museum quality. Between $140,000 and $180,000. The horologist came from Charlottesville. 3 of the 6 watches were significant. 90 to 130,000 combined. Clara kept a running total in the back of her notebook. The column growing with the slow, steady accumulation of Margaret's patience expressed in numbers. The paintings took the longest. Dr. Patricia Moreau came to the stone building in late spring and stayed 5 days. An art historian from a university in Maryland who examined the 9 canvases with an intensity that excluded conversation. Clara cooked dinner for her each evening. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about American art and the economics of the art market. Dr. Moreau was surprised by how much Clara already knew. Clara was no longer surprised by her own knowledge. She had been building it for months the way Margaret had built it for decades, piece by piece. 6 of the 9 paintings Dr. Moreau attributed with confidence. 2 by a single artist whose recent retrospective had elevated his market were worth between $800,000 and $1.2 million combined. But the 9th canvas was the reason she stayed 5 days instead of 3. The unsigned one. The one Margaret had bought for $14 at a church estate sale in the Shenandoah Valley. Clara knew the journal entry by heart. I do not know who painted it. I do not think anyone at the sale knew either. But whoever painted it understood what light does when it has enough space to move through. That is not something you can teach. That is something you see or you do not. Dr. Moreau called in September from her university. Clara was standing on the porch, the mountains going gold at the lower slopes, while the sky behind went impossibly clear and deep. The attribution is confirmed, Dr. Moreau said. The technical analysis and the comparative research support it fully. The painter had been unknown in 1977 when Margaret bought the canvas. He was not unknown now. A museum retrospective had placed him among the significant American landscape painters of his generation. $2.3 to $2.8 million. If the market was favorable, it could go higher. Clara stood on the porch and looked at the view. The same light Margaret had recognized in a $14 painting, and that the painter had recognized in whatever landscape had inspired him over a century ago. She kept building things even when she was not trying, Clara said quietly. Dr. Moreau looked at the window. The view is remarkable, she said, and your grandmother had an extraordinary eye. The manuscript was last. Dr. Emil Brandt was a paleographer from a university in Virginia, a quiet man who had spent his career studying documents from the early modern period. He stayed 6 days. He examined the manuscript under controlled conditions in the stone building. He took it to the university under an agreement Francis Nye reviewed. Clara kept copies of everything. Trust with documentation was due diligence. Naivety was trust without it. Dr. Brandt returned with a 32-page report. The manuscript was genuine, early 16th century, a merchant's travel account describing a journey through the eastern Mediterranean. Written in a chancellery hand, used in the German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Worth at current market at minimum $1 million, with the upper end unpredictable. I have been examining documents from this period for 34 years, he said. The condition of this manuscript is exceptional. Your grandmother understood what paper required to survive, and she provided it. She bought it for $45 from a book dealer in Baltimore, Clara said. She knew what she had, Dr. Brandt said simply. Then he told her about the letter. He had found it during the technical examination, tucked inside the rear cover of the leather binding. Sealed in a small envelope adhered to the inner surface with archival tape. A modern envelope, white paper. Clara's name written on the front in handwriting she recognized immediately. Small, precise, slightly slanted. Dr. Brandt had not opened it. He placed it on the table between them. Clara looked at her own in her grandmother's hand and felt the room contract around her until it was just her and the envelope and the fire ticking in the hearth and the mountain holding its breath outside the window. She waited until Dr. Brandt left before she opened it. She sat at the table alone, with the fire burning and the November light coming through the windows. She opened the envelope with the care she had been practicing on everything in this place. She unfolded the single sheet of lined paper torn from a composition notebook. My dear girl, if you are reading this letter, it means you found your way here. It means you were patient enough to look carefully and strong enough to need what I built. Both of those things make me proud. I do not know when you will read this. I do not know what will have happened in your life between now and then. I know only that I have been watching, and I have been worried, and I have been building, because building is the only answer I have ever trusted to give to worry. Everything in the cellar and in the stone building I assembled over 40 years on a librarian's salary. And the patience that your grandfather used to say was my most dangerous quality. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Do not let anyone tell you what you are worth. Not Garrett. Not any man who looks at you and sees what you can do for him rather than who you are. Not any attorney or judge or appraiser or dealer who puts a number on something without understanding what it costs to build it. If I could do this, you can do whatever comes next, but you do not have to do it alone. I was alone because I chose to be. You do not have to make the same choice. Find the people who see you clearly. Keep them close. Let them help. I love you. I have always loved you. I have loved you in the way I love everything worth keeping, quietly and completely, and for longer than anyone expected. Your grandmother, Margaret. Clara set the letter on the table. She pressed both palms flat against the wood surface and held them there. She kept her breathing steady. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried at the moment of impact. She was the kind who absorbed impact the way the stone walls of this cabin absorbed the cold. Completely, structurally, without cracking. The release would come later. Right now, she needed to hold still and receive what Margaret had given her, and understand that this was the real inheritance. Not the coins or the stamps or the paintings or the manuscript. This piece of paper, with its careful handwriting and its 40 years of love, expressed in the only language Margaret had ever fully trusted, the language of building something and leaving it for someone who would know what it meant. She folded the letter and placed it in the inside pocket of Margaret's coat, the wool coat she had found in the cedar chest in November. Next to the drawing, Wren had given her of the cabin with the oversized sun, the two most important documents she would ever own. Neither of them appraised. Neither of them worth anything to anyone except her. Both of them beyond price. The first auction was in June at a specialist numismatic house in Philadelphia. 17 coins chosen with Howard's guidance. Clara attended in person because she needed to be present for the moment when Margaret's patience was converted into a public fact. She sat in the back row. She wore a jacket she had bought at a thrift store in Charlottesville. She watched the room fill with collectors and dealers who understood the language that was about to be spoken. The first coin was a Morgan dollar. Key date, high grade. The bidding opened at $12,000 and climbed as the room narrowed. 2 bidders. Then one, $43,000. Clara sat very still and felt her grandmother's 40 years of patience arrive in the room like a presence, like someone standing just at the edge of her vision, who was pleased and unsurprised, and who had known all along that this was how it would end. Not with dramatics or fanfare, with a number spoken aloud in a room full of people who understood what the number meant. The 17 coins sold for a total of $412,000. She drove back to the cabin on roads she knew by heart now. She pulled into the gravel drive and sat with the engine off and looked at the mountains going purple in the long June evening. A color she had no name for except the one she had given it, Margaret's blue. She called Jolene that night. She told her the number. She heard the specific sound of a woman sitting down hard on the nearest available surface. Then she told Jolene what she had decided. The lease on Jolene's apartment was paid for 2 years. This was not negotiable, because Jolene had given her a couch when she had nothing, and coffee when she could not afford coffee, and opinions when she needed them. Because Wren had drawn a picture of a cabin with an oversized sun, and that picture was in the pocket of the coat Clara wore every day next to a letter from a dead woman who had saved her life. Jolene cried. She cried the way she did everything, completely and without apology, and with the full weight of a friendship that had held when everything else had broken. Clara had also set up an education fund for Wren. She did not tell Jolene on the phone. She let the documentation arrive on its own. Some things were better received in writing. Margaret had understood this. She hired Ray Hoskins to restore the cabin. Not modernize it, restore it. She showed him photographs of the cabin as she had found it and told him she wanted it to look like someone had been taking care of it for a long time. Which someone had, which she intended to continue. Ray understood without elaboration. He replaced the shingles. He reset the porch railing. He refinished the floors by hand because machine sanding would have removed the patina of decades, and the patina was part of what made the floors what they were. Same woman, he said one afternoon, standing on the porch he had rebuilt, looking at Clara the way he sometimes looked at her when she did something that reminded him of Margaret. Meaning Margaret. Meaning Clara. Meaning both. Garrett called once more. October. Clara was on the porch, the trees going red and gold in the way that Virginia trees went in October. She answered because she was done avoiding things. Done leaving doors closed that needed to be opened and walked through and closed behind her permanently. He said he had heard the collection was significant. He said he hoped she was doing well. His voice had the quality of a man who had exhausted his strategies and was left with only sincerity, which was a tool he had never been comfortable using. The cabin turned out to be a good investment, Clara said. She said it the way Margaret would have said it, plainly, accurately, without decoration. Take care of yourself, Garrett. And she ended the call. She sat on the porch and felt the last of something leave her body. the anger, the humiliation, the particular grief of having been seen incorrectly by someone you trusted to see you clearly. It left the way winter left the mountains. Not all at once, in stages. The final numbers came together in November, a full year since she had arrived. The conservative total had been 3.8 million. The confirmed total, with every attribution completed and every authentication resolved, was just over $6 million. Bernard told her the remaining collection would bring the final figure to between 7 and 8 million. She wrote the number in her notebook. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed it and went to the porch. She was not the same person who had signed the divorce papers with $47 in her account. The money had changed her circumstances. What had changed her was the year. The year of fire and cellar and journals and specialists and the slow, careful work of learning what she had and what it meant. The year of understanding that her grandmother had built her a way out before she knew she needed one. She had found it the way Margaret had built it, alone, carefully, without rushing. The key to the stone building was on a hook by the back door now. She looked at it sometimes in past, the old iron heavy with its particular weight. She thought about what Margaret had felt when she locked that door for the last time. The November evening was cold and clear. The sky enormous and bright with stars. The Milky Way a sweep of light across the southern sky. The creek in the valley below, its voice steady and patient. She stood on the porch in the cold with her hands in the pockets of Margaret's coat, her right hand touching the letter, her left hand touching Wren's drawing. The two documents that would never be appraised and would never be sold. She thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not the money, not the objects. What it meant to inherit a way of being in the world. The understanding that value accrued slowly and in secret and through attention, not through performance. That the most important things were built in the quiet, in the space where nobody was watching, in the years before you were needed. Margaret had been building for 40 years toward a future she could not specify, toward a need she could sense without naming it. She had built without telling anyone, without asking for credit. Without allowing the smallness of what it looked like from the outside to discourage what she knew about what it was on the inside. A cabin worth $1, an inheritance worth $8 million. A woman who drove the same car for 21 years. A woman whose ambition had a longer horizon than most people were willing to wait for. She had waited. She had built. She had left what she built in a place she knew would eventually be found by someone who needed it. She had been right about all of it. Clara went inside. She added a log to the fire. She made tea. She sat at the table and took a new notebook from the stack. The same black and white composition kind Margaret had used. She opened it to the first page. She wrote the date at the top. The handwriting was small and precise and slightly slanted. She had not planned for this to happen, but somewhere in the 12 months of living in Margaret's place and handling Margaret's things and reading Margaret's words, her handwriting had changed, had become something that looked, when she held the page at a distance, like the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship as a discipline rather than a preference. She did not write an inventory. She did not write a list or a calculation. She wrote something she had been carrying in her chest for weeks, and which was only now ready to be set down on paper. She wrote about Margaret, about the cellar and the stone building, and the 40 years of journals, and the letter hidden in the binding of a 500-year-old manuscript. She wrote about Jolene and Ray and Bernard and all the people who had helped her understand what she had found. The people who had seen her clearly. The people Margaret's letter had told her to keep close. She wrote about Garrett, not with anger. The anger had served its purpose, and she had set it down. She wrote about him the way you wrote about a lesson learned at great cost, and which you would not need to learn again. Briefly, without embellishment, she wrote about the $47, about what it felt like to stand in a courthouse hallway with that number in your checking account and no clear idea of what came next, and about what it felt like 12 months later to sit at a table in a cabin in the Virginia mountains with a fire burning and a notebook full of numbers that added up to a life transformed. She wrote the last line on the bottom of the page. She underlined it twice the way Margaret underlined important things. What I inherited was not a collection. It was a way of seeing the world. She closed the notebook. She set it on the shelf beside the others, the row of composition notebooks that recorded a year of inventory and research and discovery and transformation. She put on Margaret's coat and went out to the porch one last time. The stars were sharp at this elevation. The cold was real and complete. She stood in it without flinching, because she had spent a year learning that discomfort was not the same as damage, and that standing in the cold was sometimes the only way to understand how warm the fire was behind you. She thought about Margaret standing here, on this porch, looking at this sky, building her plans, carrying her secrets with the patience of a woman who understood that some things could not be rushed. That the most valuable things in the world were the ones that took the longest to build and the longest to find and the longest to understand. She had understood. It had taken her a year and a divorce and $47 and a $1 cabin and a cellar and a stone building and 6 wooden crates and a 500-year-old manuscript and a letter from a dead woman who loved her. But she had understood. The mountain held its cold and its quiet around her. The creek kept talking in the valley. The stars moved in their ancient patterns across the November sky. And Clara Mercer stood on the porch of her grandmother's thinking place and breathed the cold, clean mountain air, and knew with the certainty of a woman who had earned her certainty the hard way that whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had been made ready by a woman who drove the same car for 21 years and wore her shoes until they wore through, and worked at a library for 30 years, and built $8 million of value in a cellar and a stone building on a mountainside without telling a single living soul. A woman whose ambition had a longer horizon than most people were willing to wait for. A woman who had waited, who had built, who had been right about all of it. The fire burned low. The cabin held its warmth. The mountain held its silence. And the creek in the valley kept talking the way it had always talked, steadily, patiently, saying what it had been saying for longer than anyone could remember to anyone patient enough to listen.